Hey guys, how you doing? Welcome back. This is Rob of Rule of 2 Review, and yes, we are discussing Metroid again. And no, I am not going to continue to spam you guys with so many Metroid videos just following this crazy news about the Metroid Prime 4 delay and Nintendo restarting the game and all of that. I know that it could seem like an optimal time for me or many other channels to start to just overload you guys with topics and videos about Metroid and Metroid Prime 4, and I think that it might be easy for a lot of people to do that, including myself actually, because obviously I love to talk about Metroid. But this is, I think, a good relevant follow-up to the news from the other day, and then, like I said, don't worry, I don't plan on making non-stop Metroid videos for the next couple of weeks, just because it's hot news. Now that being said, since I do want to continue still, at least in this one follow-up video, to discuss Metroid, what I wanted to do was get into the overall concept of where Metroid goes from here. This news about the delay and everything that just happened a few days ago with Nintendo delaying the game and restarting development with Retro Studios, everything I already said, everything most of you guys I'm sure already know. My last video covered it. Hundreds upon thousands of YouTube videos covered this as well. You know, that was so insane and so, like, groundbreaking in terms of Nintendo being so transparent about this that it has myself definitely wondering, I mean, what is the plan for Metroid? And I think the main reason I'm asking this question, and I'm sure the reason a lot of you guys might be wondering the same thing, is just because I feel like we were right on the cusp of Metroid Prime 4 releasing. I mean, I really feel that if things didn't go awry behind the scenes and there wasn't issues with whatever the development team was working on Metroid Prime 4, that we would be creeping up on the final reveal of this game. You know, a lot of us expected to see this game this year, and many of us expected to even play it this year in 2019. And I mean, man, we have literally restarted this whole project, and so now we have an unspecified amount of time before we might ever see a Metroid game or Samus or play anything in the Metroid universe anytime soon. And I don't know about you guys, but I find that really depressing. And so now we have Nintendo adding another 3 or 4 years development time onto Metroid Prime 4, which means the gap between the last true Metroid game, which is Metroid Other M, not Federation Force, and Metroid Prime 4, the next Metroid game, now has another 3 or 4 years tacked onto it. So, I mean, it's going to be like like 13 years or so between Other M and when Metroid Prime 4 comes out. That's a pretty long time to wait for a series that people really care about and has a lot of dedicated, passionate fans. And, you know, like I discussed going over that news the other day, I'm sure that that's part of the reason Nintendo wanted to be so transparent. I think that they learned through the release of Other M and through the reveal and release of Federation Force that even though Metroid isn't like the biggest, most insane seller and console pusher franchises that they have, that the fan base is rabid and passionate and vocal, sometimes a little bit shittier than I think that we need to be for sure. But in general, we've got a lot to say. We care about this franchise. We don't want to see it mistreated, and we don't want to see it abandoned. And so I think that's why Nintendo felt that they needed to be upfront and honest about what's happening with Metroid Prime 4 behind the scenes, and I do ultimately see that as a good thing. We did have Metroid Samus Returns on the 3DS in 2017, so that technically I think does count as, I guess, a main Metroid entry, but it's tricky because that was a handheld game, not a console game, and it was also a remake of a previous game, and it's a damned excellent remake. And as I've said many times, it was such a remake it almost did feel like a new game, but it still technically is Metroid 2. So I still overall look at this gap between Metroid Other M and Metroid Prime 4 as the gap between mainline Metroid entries. But giving us Samus Returns now a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, was certainly great, and it was an excellent quality product to give Metroid fans while we were waiting for Metroid Prime 4, which was just revealed, you know, like an hour before that. Now, personally, I'm of the belief, and I have been for over a year, and obviously nowadays a lot of people are of the same belief as well, that the Metroid Prime trilogy is something that Nintendo has been planning and will be planning to release as some sort of remaster or re-release on the Nintendo Switch sometime this year in 2019. Now, if there's any truth to that, which more rumors have surfaced since the announcement of the Metroid Prime 4 delay that is happening, and I've obviously heard some things behind the scenes as well that makes me believe it. If Nintendo does do that, then I think that goes a long way to staving off all of us who are starving for Metroid games and the fact that Metroid Prime 4 was delayed. So that's something that Nintendo can do to keep the sort of interest and the conversation around Metroid going, keep people invested in the franchise and invested in Samus and her adventure, and really just the Metroid Prime name. I mean, as I've discussed for a year and a half now, Metroid Prime Trilogy makes sense on the Switch because people who maybe have never played those Prime games get to, no pun intended, prime themselves for the experience that will be Prime 4 by experiencing the trilogy and understanding where these games came from and how, Prime 4 is going to be a sequel to them. And it's a great way to introduce everyone to what the world of the Prime games is like, with the control scheme, the engine, everything about it. I mean, they're very unique games, and it's what makes them great, and it's what makes the first one my favorite game of all time. And so I think that a great product to keep people invested and even introduce new fans to Metroid and to Metroid Prime would be to make that trilogy. And I've discussed this as well before. There's a couple of ways that they could do this, you guys. They could make the Prime Trilogy just a straight standard definition port to the Switch with nothing special, no bells and whistles, no upgrade to the graphics. It could even be something that was digital only, like $20 or whatever, like they did on the Wii U. And it's like, that would certainly be better than nothing, but I think a lot of us like the idea of at least an HD remaster. Just kind of polish the game up, make it HD. We've seen HD Dolphin emulators running these games before as well, and they certainly look good there. But imagine if Nintendo put their own touch to it, the way they did stuff like the Wind Waker HD. I think that would be great and go a very long way. And then, of course, the most ideal and least likely option would be an actual remake from the ground up, similar to the way Sony did with Shadow of the Colossus on the PlayStation 4 last year. I've made that comparison before. That was a great game. That game essentially looks like it was made for the PS4, and then you realize, oh, but wait, this is like a PS2 game from like 15 years ago. And it just looks amazing because they rebuilt that whole game in a new engine for a modern era. And I can't imagine the amount of manpower and resources and time and money it would take to make all 3 Prime games go through the same sort of development. I mean, I really just don't think that we would see that, but it sure would be amazing. The other option I think that we may see Nintendo do beyond the Metroid Prime trilogy would be if they could sort of fast track the development of like a 2D Metroid game. And I shouldn't, let me rephrase. I don't want to use the word fast track, because it could either be that they could, spend the proper development time to make a 2D Metroid game, like a brand new game, and release that for the Switch or something, which would be fantastic. Not a remake like a Zero Mission or a Samus Returns. I mean like a brand new game. Or it could even be something, this gets me excited, it could be something where maybe Nintendo has been working on a new 2D Metroid game to release on the Switch at some point as well, and maybe they can kind of speed up development on that or make that a little bit more of a priority behind the scenes, so that maybe we could see a situation where if we pretended the Prime Trilogy came out in 2019, what if this next 2D Metroid game came out in 2020? And then it's, per my theory, 2022 would be the time that we might see Metroid Prime 4, which would only give us a 1-year gap. But that would mean that we would have seen, in this perfect world I'm creating right now in my brain, this fantasy world, we would have seen Samus Returns in 2017, Prime Trilogy HD in 2019, Metroid 2D in 2020, and then Metroid Prime 4 in 2022. And that would mean 4 Metroid games and 4 Metroid releases in 5 years between 2017 and 2022. It's definitely a lofty goal, and it's probably way more than Nintendo is planning on giving us, but I think that it becomes really interesting, When I think about another 2D Metroid game, I think about Metroid 5, you guys, and, I've discussed this before. People have brought this up to me as well. Metroid 5 has to be something that Nintendo is thinking about. And for those of you who aren't aware, the numbered Metroid games that aren't Prime, those are based on the 2D entries. That's Metroid 1 for the NES, Metroid 2 for the Game Boy, Super Metroid, which is essentially Metroid 3 for the Super Nintendo, and then Metroid Fusion, which is essentially Metroid 4 for the Game Boy. And the way the timeline and the sequential order of all these games breaks down is a little bit strange, because you throw in the Prime games and you throw in Other M, and those 4 games fit in different sort of periods between all of these different games, and that's kind of what it is. But still, we've seen all of the numbered Metroid games released that way, Metroid 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so Metroid 5, being a true sequel to Metroid Fusion, becomes a really exciting idea. And I think that Nintendo, you guys, I'm gonna say it, 99%, okay, maybe not that high, let me rephrase, 90%, we'll go with a flat 90% sure that Nintendo has been working or planning on working on a Metroid 5, some sort of 2D successor sequel to Metroid Fusion and the games that came before that. And imagine like the next level of like Nintendo Switch awesome graphics on a 2D plane for a 2D Metroid platforming side-scrolling adventure. Oh my gosh, you guys. I almost get more excited for that than I do for Prime 4 because, as I've said before, I think Metroid is best in 2D. Even though Prime 1 is my favorite game, I still think that the series ultimately shines in 2D. So, hey, maybe Nintendo's already been working on that, or maybe they're like ready to fast track that and get that out in this interim time between now and when Prime 4 would release. And then, of course, that brings us to the last option, which would be if Nintendo planned on doing absolutely nothing. What if there's no plan? What if, after Samus Returns came out, their plan was to get Metroid Prime 4 out in 2019 and then call it a day? And that's all they'd been working on, all they'd been planning, and you know, once Prime 4 came out, they were then going to look into whatever they wanted to do next for Metroid after Prime 4. And so that would mean that now that they've chosen to delay Prime 4 and restart development and add another 3 or 4 years to development time, maybe they literally were caught with their pants down and they have nothing planned. And it's like, wow, I guess people are just going to be waiting a long time for Metroid. And I think that that would be a shame because I think that we're in this perfect sort of window of time right now where it's the best opportunity for Metroid and Samus to have the resurgence it deserves. Because we all know it struggled in the dark times with Other M and Federation Force. And you know, I also like those two games, but I also admit that they were the dark times because they were very divisive and people didn't like or really buy them in mass numbers. And so we need something to kind of bring Metroid back into the forefront and remind people why it's one of the most successful and well-loved franchises of all time. And a 1-2 punch of Samus Returns and Prime 4 would have done that. And now it's like, well, maybe we're meant to just wait this other, couple of years until Prime 4 comes out, and Nintendo isn't going to be able to do anything to show Metroid fans that there's other games coming in this time period. And it's one of those things where it's not like I would necessarily trade the delay of Metroid Prime 4 to have a bad game release now. I have to say that ultimately it's still the smart move, and if they miss this window of time for the resurgence, then they miss it. I'm more interested in Prime 4 releasing as the perfect game it's supposed to be than just fast-tracking a bunch of half-assed Metroid games or a half-assed Metroid Prime 4 and just get it out there to get it out there. Like, that's the last thing we need for Metroid. For any game, really. And so I'm happy to say, yes, they should have delayed it if they needed to delay it, but it would be really great if they had something to release. And, as I said on Twitter and a little bit in my last video, I think it's entirely possible that even if the Prime Trilogy hadn't already been a plan, that now that they've delayed the game, and now that we seemingly have no Metroid games to play for a couple of years, I think that now, if anything, Nintendo's ready to make the Prime Trilogy and release this on the Switch, and get people excited and thinking about Metroid so that it doesn't fade from everyone's memory, and then it just kind of goes away. So at the end of the day, these are my thoughts. What do you guys think about Metroid? Where do you think the franchise will go from now while we wait to hear more about Metroid Prime 4? I mean, if Nintendo isn't going to be able to even show us Metroid Prime 4 until like 2021, it's a long time to wait, man. That's another 2 years to wait with nothing to play. I gotta feel the Prime Trilogy is coming sometime soon. Like I said, recent reports and quotes from like Imran Quain, I think is his name, the guy who works for Game Informer, and some other people say that, yeah, the Prime Trilogy is ready to go. It's almost done. And like I said, I've been hearing this behind the scenes for a long time as well. So do you think the Prime Trilogy is going to happen? Do you think a Metroid 5 or a 2D Metroid is something that we might get between now and Prime 4? Whatever you think, whatever you expect, whatever you want, talk about it below. And I think that's going to be it for me for today. So thanks as always for tuning in, guys. This is Rob of Ro2R, and I'll catch you next time on another video.